There's a very specific kind of fear that only shows up when you realize the person who smiles at you the brightest is also the person most capable of ruining your life. Not by accident, not by a misunderstanding, but by calmly choosing you as the scapegoat. And then watching you drown in it. That's the heartbeat of Kecelakaan Akan Terjadi, the 2026 drama that basically grabbed me by the collar in the first stretch and refused to let go. I'm talking about full story spoilers in this review, because this drama's entire appeal is in how it plays with cause and effect, suspicion, and the emotional math of revenge versus survival. So if you haven't watched it yet and you want to go in totally clean, this is your sign to bookmark the video, run, and come back later. And if you like these long, slightly obsessive breakdowns, you can subscribe to Flick Flare so you don't miss the next one. The setup is deliciously cruel in a way that feels instantly relatable even if you've never lived anything close to it. Sania is thrown back to the beginning of a tragedy, the day her best friend Vivian borrows her car. In the life she already lived once, Vivian uses that car, hits Mrs. Helen, and Mrs. Helen dies. And then, this is the part that makes your stomach drop. Vivian doesn't just panic. She pins it on Sania. She frames her. She turns Sania's generosity into a weapon and rewrites her entire life in one stroke. That's the memory Sania wakes up with, and you can feel how her body remembers it before her face even does. And what I love right away is that the drama doesn't waste time turning Sania into a superhuman chess master. It makes her human. She's not cool. She's not instantly witty and composed. She's scared. She's hyper-aware. She's doing that thing where your eyes keep flicking to ordinary objects, the car keys, the door lock, the phone on the table, as if they might bite. When the story is about a disaster that already happened to you once, the ordinary becomes haunted. The day isn't just a day anymore. It's a loaded gun. So Sania makes the first big pivot. She refuses to lend Vivian the car. And then she installs a surveillance camera. Two choices that sound simple on paper, but emotionally, they're huge. Because refusing Vivian isn't just refusing a request. It's Sania stepping out of the version of herself Vivian depended on. The accommodating friend, the friend who doesn't ask too many questions, the friend who believes in the best interpretation of everything. Installing the camera isn't just being smart. It's Sania admitting, out loud in her actions, that she doesn't trust her best friend. And that hurts even if you're right. Here's the thing that kept pulling me through. The story isn't only asking, can Sania change the outcome? It's asking, what does it cost to try? Because in these second chance narratives, people always sell you the fantasy of control. You get to redo the conversation. You get to pick the better option. You get to be prepared. But Kecelakaan Akan Terjadi keeps brushing up against a more unsettling idea. Preparation doesn't erase trauma. Sometimes it sharpens it. Sometimes it means you relive the worst day of your life with even more detail. And that's where the title lands with this interesting, slightly provocative weight. That accident will not happen. It sounds like a promise. It sounds like a mantra you repeat to keep yourself from falling apart. But it also reads like denial, doesn't it? Like the kind of sentence you say when you're trying to force the universe to behave. The drama understands that tension, and it uses it as its engine. The Vivian problem is what makes this premise feel like it has teeth. If Vivian were just a cartoon villain, this would be a quick binge and a forgettable one. But the drama's premise already implies something more complicated. Vivian is close enough to Sania to borrow her car casually, meaning there's history, trust, shared memories. That's why the betrayal is so nauseating. And it's also why every interaction after the reset becomes a psychological minefield. Because Sania is looking at a face she used to love, with the knowledge of what that face will do when it decides you're convenient to destroy. There a moment early on, this is the kind of scene that plays in your head like you've lived it, where the request itself becomes the threat. Vivian asks for the car like it's nothing. Just a normal day, normal friend stuff, that familiar tone that says, "Come on, you always help me." And Sania is standing there hearing two soundtracks at once. The present, with Vivian's voice light and casual, and the past, with sirens in the distance and the sickening realization of being framed. You can almost feel Sania's fingers going cold around the keys she's not handing over. The camera doesn't need to do anything flashy. The tension is already in the air like humidity before a storm. And when Sania says no, it's not triumphant. It's trembling. That's such a smart choice emotionally, because refusing someone you used to trust can feel like grief. You're not just protecting yourself, you're burying something. You're acknowledging that the friendship you thought you had might already be dead. Now, the surveillance camera. I have to talk about the surveillance camera, because this is where the drama quietly tells you what kind of story it wants to be. It could have leaned into melodrama. It could have leaned into courtroom twists and big, operatic confrontations every episode. Instead, the camera choice pulls it toward paranoia, toward a colder kind of tension. The idea that proof is the only thing that matters when reality can be rewritten by the person with better timing and a cleaner lie. And I know some viewers are going to cheer at that like, yes, Queen, gather evidence. I did, too, part of me. But here's a slightly contrarian take that I actually think the drama is brave for inviting. Installing a camera also corrodes you. It makes your home feel like a crime scene waiting to happen. It turns your daily life into footage. It makes you watch people instead of know them. And in a story about friendship betrayal, that's a bitter little irony. Sania is trying to prevent being framed, but she's also forced into becoming the kind of person who lives through suspicion. That's not a criticism, by the way. That's what I think is interesting about it. The drama isn't just giving Sania wins. It's giving her defensive adaptations. And defensive adaptations keep you alive, but they don't always keep you soft. You can also feel the writers setting up a question that's way nastier than who did it. If the original timeline involved Vivian hitting Mrs. Helen and then pinning it on Sania, the new timeline basically asks, if Sania blocks that one path, does fate reroute? Does the tragedy come anyway through a different door? Because stories like this don't stay tense unless you believe the universe can still hurt the protagonist. The moment you feel like Sania can just outsmart everyone with a camera and a firm no, the story's over. And that rerouting anxiety is where the drama starts to feel less like a simple revenge redo and more like a meditation on inevitability. Not in a mystical way, either. In a social way. Like, if the original disaster happened partly because Vivian could manipulate the narrative, then stopping the car accident doesn't necessarily stop Vivian's ability to manipulate. It just changes the tool. Mrs. Helen, even from the limited framing we're given, functions as more than a plot device victim. She's the moral weight. She's the reminder that this isn't just a catfight, or a friendship breakup, or an ego war. Someone died. And the show's title daring you to believe that accident won't happen makes Mrs. Helen's presence hover over everything like a conscience. In these kinds of stories, it's easy to become so invested in the protagonist winning that you forget the victim. This drama doesn't let you forget her for long, because the shadow of that death is the very thing powering Sania's choices. What I found compelling is how the premise automatically splits your emotional focus into two tracks. One track is justice for Sania, because framing someone for a fatal hit and run is one of those unforgivable, life-erasing crimes. The other track is prevention, saving Mrs. Helen, stopping the collision, refusing to let the tragedy exist at all. And those tracks don't always align neatly, because justice might mean exposing Vivian, punishing her, burning her life down the way she burned Sania's. Prevention might mean making choices that keep Vivian close enough to monitor, which is emotionally exhausting. This is the kind of messy ethical tension that gives the drama its staying power. And yes, I'm going to say it. I like that Sania's first move isn't some elaborate trap. It's boundaries. It's no, you can't have access to me like that anymore. There's something quietly radical about a second-gen story that starts with a woman simply refusing to be used, rather than immediately trying to destroy the other woman. It reads less like wish fulfillment and more like recovery, even if it's recovery with teeth. Let's talk about Vivian for a second, because this character archetype can go so wrong if the writing leans lazy. Vivian is positioned as the betrayer, the one who in the previous life kills someone and frames her friend. That's already monstrous. The challenge for the drama is, how do you keep her watchable? How do you keep her from becoming one note? And the premise itself gives the drama a weapon. Vivian doesn't know she's being watched by Sanya, who remembers. So Vivian gets to exist in her pre-mask slip state, which is the creepiest version of a manipulator when they still think they're safe. In scenes like that, the tension isn't what will Vivian do in an immediate sense. It's what is Vivian capable of, and how quickly can she pivot if she senses resistance. The car request is basically a diagnostic test. When Sanya refuses, you're not only watching Sanya stand firm, you're watching Vivian's reaction for hairline fractures. Does she guilt trip? Does she charm? Does she get cold? Does she laugh it off and store it for later? Even if the show doesn't spell out every micro-intention, you as a viewer become hyper-attuned to them, because Sanya is. This is also where the performances matter a lot. And I'm going to keep this general and respectful since we're not naming actors here. Sanya's role needs someone who can hold two realities in their eyes at the same time, the outward normal conversation and the inner panic spiral. If the performance is too big, it turns melodramatic. If it's too flat, you don't feel the trauma. The strongest version of Sanya is when she looks almost calm, but her voice is slightly delayed, like her brain is checking the room for exits before her mouth answers. That kind of acting is what makes the redo concept believable rather than gimmicky. Vivian, on the other hand, needs that dangerous warmth. The smile that reads friendly to everyone else and predatory to you, because you know what it hides. And if you've ever dealt with someone who weaponizes closeness, you know how chilling that is. They don't need to shout. They just need to know you care. One thing I'll give the writing a lot of credit for, even from just the core premise. It understands that framing someone isn't just about evidence. It's about social positioning. It's about who people are inclined to believe. Vivian doesn't just have to commit an act. She has to curate a story where Sanya looks plausible as the villain. That's why Sanya's camera feels less like a gotcha tool and more like armor in a world where perception becomes law. And can I just do a quick aside here? Because every time a drama introduces a camera as the solution, my brain immediately goes, great. Now we get to watch technology fail at the exact worst moment. I don't know why I'm like this. Maybe I've been burned by fiction too many times. But it's a real tension builder, because once a story tells you, here's proof, the next question is, okay, so what's going to happen to the proof? The direction and visuals, at least as implied by this premise and the kind of scenes it demands, really thrive when they lean into that sense of watchness. A drama like this lives and dies on how it frames ordinary spaces. The home shouldn't feel fully safe. The driveway, the street, the place where the car is parked, those locations become charged. Even the act of Vivian glancing at the car keys can feel like a threat if the camera lingers half a beat too long. And if the show is smart, it uses reflections, windows, mirrors, phone screens to keep reminding you that observation is part of the story's texture. Sound design, too, can do a lot of heavy lifting here. You don't need bombastic music to make a request terrifying. Sometimes you just need the absence of music, the slight hum of a fan, the faint noise of traffic outside, and then the jingle of keys. A tiny sound that suddenly feels like a countdown. If the score does come in, I want it subtle, more pulse than melody. So the tension feels like it's coming from Sanya's body, not from the soundtrack telling you what to feel. Thematically, this drama is playing in a space I always find fascinating, the idea that one small choice can alter a life. But the smaller truth is that choices don't happen in a vacuum. Sanya refusing to lend the car changes a logistical detail. Yes. But the original tragedy wasn't just a car being borrowed. It was trust being exploited. It was Vivian feeling entitled to Sania's resources, and then entitled to Sania's life as collateral when things went wrong. So the deeper question becomes, can Sania actually change the outcome without changing the relationship? Because if Vivian still has access to Sania's world, her routines, her social circles, her reputation, then Vivian still has levers. Maybe not the exact same lever as borrow the car, but something adjacent. That's why the drama's central conflict is inherently more psychological than procedural. The accident is the spark, but the gasoline is the dynamic between these two women. And for you as a viewer, that creates this constant, low-grade dread. Even in scenes that should be calm, your brain is scanning like Sania's is scanning. You start to wonder which detail will matter later. You start to suspect every kindness. You start to feel how exhausting it must be to live inside that vigilance. The show doesn't have to do jump scares. The dread is social. This is also where I think the drama can split audiences. And I'm already seeing it in how people talk about premises like this. Some viewers come for the satisfaction of revenge and exposure. They want the betrayer publicly destroyed, period. Other viewers are more interested in the psychological realism. What it does to a person to have to smile at someone who ruined them, what it costs to keep your composure, what it means to pursue truth in a world that rewards the most convincing liar. Kecelakaan itu tak Akan Terjadi, at least in its concept, is built to feed both appetites. But it has to balance them carefully or it risks frustrating everyone. Because here's the danger. If the story leans too hard into Sania outsmarts Vivian every time, tension evaporates. But if it leans too hard into fate always finds a way, it can start to feel punishing, like the drama is just inventing new misery to extend the run. The sweet spot is when Sania earns small victories that still leave her shaken, because the win doesn't heal her. It just keeps her alive long enough to fight again. I also want to talk about how the premise implicitly frames Sania's morality, and why I think that's more complex than it first appears. Sania's refusal and surveillance are self-defense. But self-defense, especially against someone close to you, often looks cold from the outside. If you're a third party in that world, Vivian could easily sell the narrative of Sania being paranoid, controlling, suddenly rude. And that's what makes gaslighting stories so infuriating. The protective behavior becomes the evidence used against you. The person who's trying to stop harm is painted as the problem. If the drama is willing to go there, it can get painfully real. It can show how survivors of betrayal have to manage not only the threat, but the optics of defending themselves. You don't just need to be safe. You need to look sane while you do it. And that is why the camera is such a loaded symbol. It's an attempt to externalize truth. To say, I'm not crazy. This happened. But the harsh lesson of these stories is that even footage can be doubted, dismissed, edited, explained away, especially when the social environment wants the easier story. The drama title is a promise about an accident, but the more haunting promise is about narrative. Will the truth finally stick this time? I'll be honest. The premise hit me harder than I expected, because I've seen smaller versions of this dynamic in real life. Nothing this extreme, obviously, but the vibe of it. That moment when you realize someone is comfortable lying about you because they know people will believe them. When I was watching the setup, I had this weird impulse to pause, not because it was confusing, but because it was too familiar in its emotional logic. Like my body went, oh, we're doing this kind of story. And I mean that as a compliment. Stories that touch a nerve are doing something right, even if they make you squirm. One of the smartest things Kecelakaan itu tak Akan Terjadi can do. And from the setup, it feels like it's at least aiming in that direction, is letting Sania's second chance be messy. Because a second chance isn't therapy. It's not closure. It's more like being dropped back into a burning building with the knowledge of where the smoke gets thickest. You might save someone this time, but you still have to breathe in the smoke to do it. And the friendship element makes it even sharper. Romantic betrayal stories are everywhere. We're used to them. But friendship betrayal, especially between women in a drama like this, has a different texture. It's quieter. It's domestic. It lives in borrowed items and shared spaces, and I thought you knew me. The car is such a perfect object for that. It's not just property. It's trust with an engine. What I kept coming back to while watching this kind of setup is how power works when it's informal. Vivian doesn't need official authority to destroy Sania. She just needs access, timing, and the willingness to do it. And Sania's journey, at least at the start, is about reclaiming power in the same informal spaces. Her own home, her own boundaries, her own ability to say no without explaining herself into exhaustion. Now, if you're the kind of viewer who needs fast plot fireworks every 10 minutes, I can already tell you, the most interesting version of this story is the one that lingers in the microtension. The pauses, the looks, the polite conversations where every word is a trap. That's where the dread lives. That's where the acting matters. That's where the direction either builds the pressure cooker or lets it leak out. Because here's a question I couldn't stop asking myself once Sania put that camera up. What happens to a person when evidence becomes the only language they trust? When they stop seeking understanding and start seeking proof? It's effective, sure. But it also changes how you love, how you forgive, how you even interpret neutral behavior. Every smile becomes data. And the drama is set up to weaponize that against Sania in a really emotionally brutal way. Because even if Vivian never touches the car again, Sania still has to live in a world where Vivian exists. Vivian can still show up with softness. Vivian can still perform sincerity. Vivian can still say, "Why are you acting like this?" And if you've ever dealt with someone like that, you know the worst part isn't the obvious attack. The worst part is the plausible innocence. There's also an interesting moral ache around Mrs. Helen. Preventing the accident isn't only about clearing Sania's name. It's about saving a life. And that shifts the stakes from personal revenge to something more human. But it also creates this pressure. If Sania fails, it's not just her life ruined again. It's someone dead again. That's a terrifying responsibility to carry on your back, especially when the person who caused it in the first place is standing right there acting normal. And in terms of pacing, this is where the drama has to be careful with escalation. The first refusal is a big move. The first camera install is a big move. After that, the story needs to find new ways to twist the knife without just repeating Vivian tries again, Sania blocks her again. The best way to do that is to deepen the psychological game, to complicate motives, to introduce situations where Sania's choices have collateral consequences. Not because the writers want to punish her, but because second chances are complicated. You change one thing and something else shifts. What I appreciate in a drama like this is when it treats trauma memory as both an advantage and a burden. Sania remembers what Vivian did, which gives her a map. But trauma memory isn't a clean map. It's fragmented, emotional, sometimes unreliable in the details, but painfully accurate in the feeling. That means Sania might overcorrect. She might misinterpret. She might see betrayal in a neutral gesture. And if the drama leans into that with empathy, it makes Sania feel real instead of perfectly strategic. And honestly, that's where I personally connect with her the most. Not when she's winning, but when she's struggling to keep her humanity intact while doing what she has to do. Anyone can write a revenge fantasy. It takes more care to write a survival story that doesn't romanticize what survival turns you into. One more craft thing I want to linger on, the symbolism of the car itself. In the previous life, the car is the instrument of tragedy. Its speed, force, irreversible impact. In the new life, the car becomes a boundary object. It's the thing Sania can control, at least at first. The keys become a metaphor for access. Who gets to drive your life? Who gets to borrow your safety? Who gets to claim innocence while holding the weapon? I love when a drama takes an everyday object and lets it gather meaning until you feel tense just looking at it. And if the show is really on its game, it'll make you feel that tension even when the car is just sitting there, untouched. Because the fear isn't only about the accident. It's about what people are willing to do when their convenience is threatened. Vivian's original choice to frame Sania tells you something chilling. Vivian values self-preservation more than Sania's life. That's the true threat. The accident is just the easiest mask for it. So as the story pushes forward from that initial pivot, Sania saying no, Sania setting up surveillance, the real hook becomes this. Can Sania expose Vivian without becoming consumed by Vivian? Can she protect Mrs. Helen without letting the looming catastrophe define every breath she takes? And most importantly, if fate really can be altered, will altering it finally free her? Or will it just force Vivian to get more creative in the ways she tries to take control of the narrative, especially once Vivian starts to sense that Sania is no longer playing the old role of the endlessly trusting friend, and instead is watching her with a kind of quiet, contained fear that looks a lot like resolve, which is exactly the kind of change that can make a manipulator start testing new angels, pressing on different pressure points, and turning ordinary social moments into little battlegrounds where the stakes are invisible to everyone else in the room but feel life or death to Sania as she tries to keep her voice steady while Vivian keeps talking like nothing has changed, even though everything has. And you can feel that tension building in the spaces between their words as the story starts to lean into what happens when the person you're protecting yourself from is still close enough to smile right in your face. And once that shift happens, the drama starts asking you to watch a very uncomfortable thing. What does Vivian do when her favorite lever doesn't work anymore? Because manipulators don't usually explode immediately. They probe. They try a different tone. They act wounded. They recruit sympathy. They make you feel like the cruel one for having boundaries. And the premise alone tells you Vivian has the stomach for big lies, which means she probably has the patience for small ones too. That's why I found Sania's no so satisfying but also so risky. Refusing the car is a hard boundary, but it's also a flare shot into the sky. It signals, I'm not the same Sania you knew. And the second you do that with someone like Vivian, you invite retaliation, not necessarily loud retaliation, not necessarily immediate, but the kind that seeps into your life through reputation, friendships, and the social air people breathe around you. One of the most interesting tensions in Kecelakaan Itu Tak Akan Terjadi is that it's not just about avoiding the accident. It's about avoiding the framing. Because in the original timeline, Vivian didn't only cause harm, she authored a story. She wrote a version of reality where Sania became the villain. So now Sania's mission is to fold, prevent the tragedy, and prevent the narrative from forming around her again. That's a different kind of battle than just stop a crash. Because narratives don't require tires on asphalt. Narratives can be built with a whisper, a tearful phone call, a well-timed I don't know why she's acting like this. The camera, then, becomes less of a gadget and more of a philosophy. It's Sania saying, I am done trusting vibes. And I get it. I really do. But it also turns her into someone who has to live like she's in a case file. It's hard to be a person when your brain is constantly trying to become a prosecutor. If the drama is doing what I think it's doing, it's also inviting you to feel the claustrophobia of that. Surveillance isn't just watching Vivian, it's watching yourself. It's being aware that your reactions are being shaped by fear, and then being afraid of your fear. That's a spiral, and it's a spiral a lot of thrillers skip over because it's not fun. This show's premise has the potential to make that spiral the point. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes with knowing the truth early. Sania is walking around with a secret that is too big to share casually. Imagine trying to tell anyone, hey, my best friend framed me for a fatal accident in another timeline, so I put up cameras. Even if someone believes you, you still sound unwell. And that's what makes time reset stories such good vehicles for psychological isolation. The protagonist is burdened with certainty, but the world is burdened with normalcy. Those two things don't fit together, and it makes every normal interaction sting. Vivian laughs at a joke. Vivian asks how Sania's doing. Vivian touches her arm. Ordinary friendship gestures, Except Sania's body is remembering the courtroom, the accusations, the way a lie can harden into a verdict. The show doesn't have to spell it out. The premise already supplies the ache. You're watching a friendship that, to Vivian, might still feel intact, while to Sania, it's like holding a beautiful object that you know is poisoned. Here's where the drama gets especially sneaky in a way I really appreciate. It frames fate as something that isn't supernatural, but behavioral. People here, can destiny be changed? And they think cosmic forces, like the universe pushing a boulder downhill. But in this story, destiny might just be Vivian's character. Vivian's willingness to protect herself at any cost. Vivian's ability to weaponize closeness. If that's the real engine of tragedy, then even if the accident itself doesn't happen the same way, the harm could still arrive because the person who caused it hasn't changed. And that raises a brutal question that I kept turning over while watching this kind of narrative unfold. Is Sania trying to change fate? Or is she trying to change a person? Because changing a person is much harder than changing a schedule. The premise also sets up something I always look for in revenge-adjacent stories. Does the protagonist become reactive, or do they become intentional? Sania's first moves are reactive in the healthiest sense. She's responding to a known threat. But the deeper you go, the more you want to see her reclaim her own life beyond just prevent Vivian. Not because it's less dramatic, but because it's more meaningful. It's the difference between surviving and living. And dramas like this can accidentally trap the protagonist in a perpetual defensive crouch where every scene is about the villain. The best versions let the protagonist slowly build a self that exists outside the villain's gravity. Now, because we are working from the core storyline, I'm not going to sit here and pretend I can walk you through every twist beat for beat. But I can tell you what the shape of the most satisfying version of this story looks like, and what choices would make it land emotionally. The big one is escalation through social consequences, not just physical danger. The accident is a physical event, but the framing is a social event. If the show keeps its focus on the social mechanics, who believes whom, how rumors spread, how institutions respond when two women tell different stories, then it stays sharp. And that's also where Mrs. Helen becomes such a key piece of the emotional puzzle. Because she's not just the victim. She represents the innocent bystander caught in someone else's moral rot. In a way, Mrs. Helen is the cost of Vivian's self-preservation. Sania remembers that cost. That memory should change how she moves through the world now. Not just fear, but urgency. Not just revenge, but responsibility. One of the directions I really hope the drama leans into, based on its premise, is the idea that saving someone isn't always straightforward. Sania can refuse the car. Great. But what if that doesn't automatically keep Mrs. Helen safe? What if the danger comes from a different angle entirely? An intersection of timing, stress, other drivers, or Vivian making a different choice because she's blocked. That's when the show can really mess with you in the best way, because it turns the question from will the same thing happen again into how many variables does one person's desperation contaminate? And speaking of desperation, I kept finding myself wanting the drama to interrogate Vivian beyond just she's evil. Not to excuse her, not to soften the betrayal. But because the scariest villains in stories like this aren't the ones who are obviously monstrous. It's the ones who feel rational to themselves. Vivian framed Sania once. So in Vivian's mind, what story did she tell herself to make that okay? I had no choice. Sania will be fine. Sania owes me. Everyone would have done the same. That internal logic matters. It's the blueprint for how she'll behave the next time she's cornered. And yes, I can already hear some of you going, why are you trying to humanize her? I'm not trying to give her a halo. I'm trying to make the threat coherent. Because incoherent villains are easy to beat. Coherent villains are terrifying. The premise of Vivian successfully framing Sania implies a certain competence. It implies planning, emotional manipulation, a willingness to weaponize institutions. That's not a spur-of-the-moment panic. That's a skill set. And if Vivian has a skill set, then Sania's battle isn't just about one day. It's about undoing a system of lies. There's also an emotional realism question the drama has to face. Can Sania convincingly keep up the act around Vivian? If you've ever had to be polite to someone you don't trust, you know how exhausting it is after 10 minutes. Now imagine doing it while your entire future depends on not tipping your hand too early. The performance required isn't just from the actor playing Sania. It's from the character. Sania has to perform normal friend while internally tracking threats. That dual performance is one of the hardest things to make believable. And if the show nails it, you get this constant tightrope walk, where even tiny lines carry double meaning. A simple, sure, that's fine, can read like compliance on the surface, and like a warning underneath. A pause before answering can become suspicious. The show can create tension out of politeness. That's such an underrated thriller tool, especially in dramas centered around interpersonal betrayal rather than, like, masked killers. I also think the camera choice opens up a visual language that can be genuinely gripping if the directors want to play. Surveillance footage is inherently flat and ugly, right? It's impersonal. It's clinical. So if the drama intercuts warm, intimate close-ups of Vivian smiling with cold, white surveillance angels of the same space, you get this thematic contrast. The face versus the fact. The curated self versus the recorded behavior. Even without doing anything flashy, that contrast tells a story. And then there's editing. A drama like this can use repetition really effectively, showing you the same moment from the prior timeline in Sania's memory versus the new timeline with a different outcome. When repetition is done well, it becomes a drumbeat of anxiety. When it's done lazily, it becomes padding. The difference is whether the repeated moment reveals something new emotionally. A repeated request for the car, for example, isn't interesting because it's the same line. It's interesting because Sania's reaction is different, because the air in the room is different, because the power balance is shifting. Let me throw out another question that kept hooking me as I watched this premise play out. What happens when Vivian realizes she's losing control of Sania? Because losing control is when people like Vivian show you who they really are. When their charm stops working, they either escalate or they retreat and regroup. Both are dangerous. Escalation is obvious. Retreat is patient. Retreat means Vivian starts building the story slowly, quietly, in the background, so that when she strikes again, people are already primed to doubt Sania. That's why I actually think the most terrifying thing Vivian could do in a story like this isn't another dramatic act. It's planting seeds. It's making Sania look unstable. It's casually mentioning to someone, I'm worried about her lately. It's creating a world where, when something goes wrong, anything, Sania becomes the easiest suspect again. Framing isn't just one lie. It's scaffolding. And now we're back to the theme of inevitability. Except it's not fate. It's social momentum. Once a community believes a version of you, it's hard to pry it loose. Sania knows that because she's lived it. So her fight isn't only with Vivian. It's with the inertia of belief. I want to pause on Mrs. Helen again, because this is where the story can either stay shallow or become genuinely haunting. If Mrs. Helen remains a distant name, then the drama risks turning the death into a plot coupon. But if the writing allows Mrs. Helen's existence to feel real, through the way people talk about her, through the weight of her absence, through the moral consequences rippling outward, then the entire redo gains gravity. It turns the story from Sania wants revenge into Sania refuses to let a human life be reduced to someone else's escape route. And that, to me, is where Sania's character can become quietly heroic without turning into a superhero. It's not heroic to install a camera. It's practical. What's heroic is choosing to care about the person who died even when your own life is on fire. It's choosing prevention over spectacle. This also ties into something I felt pretty strongly while watching. Second chance narratives can sometimes become too clean. They become, oh, I made the right choices, and now everything is fixed. Life isn't like that. Trauma isn't like that. If the drama is emotionally honest, Sania's second chance doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like an extended emergency. Even if she changes the immediate outcome, she still has to live with the knowledge of what Vivian is capable of. That knowledge doesn't vanish just because you dodged one bullet. And that's why I didn't want the show to rush into immediate catharsis. I know some viewers will be impatient like, expose Vivian already. I get it. Believe me, I get it. But a fast exposure can actually undercut the horror of what happened. The horror isn't just the reveal that Vivian is bad. The horror is how long Vivian got away with it in the first place. The horror is how convincing she was. The horror is what it did to Sania's sense of reality. You can't heal that with one viral clip. A slight tangent, but it matters. Dramas about women in conflict often get flattened by audiences into they're just jealous or it's petty. This premise is the opposite of petty. This is existential. This is about how a woman can be punished for being kind, and how another woman can exploit intimacy as an instrument of control. If you approach it like messy besties, you'll miss the point. And I really hope the writing keeps insisting on the stakes, because the stakes are life and death, literally and socially. There's also an angle here about class and status that the show could be touching, depending on how it frames Vivian and Mrs. Helen. A hit-and-run story often carries an implicit social commentary. Whose life is considered expendable, whose story gets believed, who has the resources to shape a narrative. Even without making it a heavy message drama, the premise naturally sits near those questions. Vivian framed Sania successfully once. That implies Vivian had either social leverage, convincing performance, or access to systems that Sania couldn't fight. That dynamic matters. Music-wise, I'd love for the score to have a motif that's almost mundane. Not a big villain theme. Something like a subtle ticking pulse whenever Sania's memory overlays the present. Something that makes you feel the reset as pressure rather than magic. And if the drama uses silence strategically, cutting music entirely when Sania is forced to lie through a conversation with Vivian, that can hit harder than any swelling strings. Silence makes you listen to breath. It makes you notice how long a pause is. What I kept coming back to emotionally, though, is the friendship grief. Because even when Sania is doing everything right, the drama is still about loss. She lost her old self. She lost the innocence of trusting her best friend. And if she succeeds in preventing the tragedy, she still doesn't get that innocence back. That's a kind of tragedy people don't talk about enough. The tragedy of being right, of being validated by evidence, but still feeling hollow because the person you loved turned out to be a threat. And the show's title almost taunts you with that. That accident will not happen. Okay, maybe it won't. But what about the betrayal? What about the years of fear? What about the way Sania's nervous system now lives, like it's bracing for impact even in quiet moments? The drama is strongest when it remembers that preventing an accident doesn't automatically restore a life. Here's another uncomfortable thought the premise opens up. What if, in trying to prevent the accident and the frame job, Sania becomes more isolated, more controlling, more mistrustful? So even if she wins alone? That's the kind of bittersweet win that actually feels earned in stories like this. Not everything is perfect now, but I'm free and I'm different. And freedom being different is a scary sell to some audiences. People want restoration. They want the original version of Sania back, just with justice served. But restoration is a fantasy. The drama, if it's emotionally sincere, has to acknowledge that Sania's second chance is still built on the bones of what happened. She can't unknow it. She can't unfeel it. The other reason this story sticks is because it taps into a very modern anxiety about proof and truth. We live in an era where people record everything, and yet reality still feels negotiable. You can show someone a clip, and they'll say it's edited. You can show a timeline, and they'll say it's framed. So a drama that anchors its hope in surveillance also invites you to confront the limits of surveillance. evidence isn't the same as justice. Proof isn't the same as belief. Sometimes the system doesn't care. Sometimes the community doesn't care. Sometimes people choose the story that's easier to live with. That's why I think the most dramatic moments in a show like this aren't necessarily the action beats. They're the moments where Sania realizes she's not fighting for the truth. She's fighting for the right people to hear it. And that's an exhausting, dehumanizing fight. If the writers want to twist the knife in the most effective way, they don't need new villains. They just need the ordinary world to continue being ordinary. To have someone brush off Sania's concerns. To have someone tell her she's overreacting. To have Vivian's mask work on everyone else. Because that's what makes you feel trapped. Not that you lack intelligence, but that you lack an audience. I also want to give credit to the premise for making Sania's solution imperfect. Because the camera can capture what happens in its frame, but the world is bigger than a frame. Vivian could do something off camera. Vivian could manipulate someone else. Vivian could create situations where the truth is ambiguous. The camera isn't a magic wand. It's one line of defense. And once you accept that, the story stays tense. There's a moment I kept imagining while watching, not because the show explicitly showed it to me, but because it's the emotional logic of the setup. Sania alone at night, replaying footage, not even because she expects to catch Vivian doing something that night, but because she can't stop checking. Because her brain learned that danger can look normal until it's too late. That's what trauma does. It turns vigilance into habit. And if the performance sells that, if the direction lingers on the glow of a screen in a dark room, it becomes less about plot and more about the cost of survival. And that's the thing I need you to understand if you're deciding whether to watch this drama. It's not just a thriller. It's an anxiety machine. In a good way, if you like that. In a potentially miserable way, if you don't. It's the kind of story that makes you sit forward. But it also makes you tired, because you're empathizing with someone who can't relax. Now, the biggest gamble this drama makes, conceptually, is that it asks you to invest in a repeated day, a repeated trigger. That's always tricky. Repetition can feel genius, or it can feel stagnant. The only way it feels genius is if each repetition reveals a different layer. If Sania learns something new each time she navigates Vivian. If she understands more about how the framing worked, not just that it happened. If she starts seeing the small pre-accident behaviors she missed the first time, the subtle steps of a manipulation she didn't recognize because she was inside the friendship. And this is where I think the drama has a chance to deliver something more emotionally complex than Sania versus Vivian. It can become Sania versus her own past self. Not in a judgmental way, in a compassionate way. Like, Sania has to forgive the version of herself that trusted Vivian. She has to stop blaming herself for being kind. Because victims of framing and betrayal often do that, they replay every decision like, if I had just said no. But the real culprit was always the person willing to exploit yes. If you've ever been through something where someone twisted your generosity into guilt, Sania's arc can feel weirdly validating. Because it's not saying, you were stupid. It's saying, you were loving, and someone abused it. That distinction matters. And it's why I get protective of stories like this when audiences mock the protagonist for trusting. Trust isn't a character flaw. It's a human baseline. The villain is the person who turns it into a trap. The other thing I'm watching for, and what really determines whether this story stays compelling deep into its run, is whether Vivian ever experiences genuine pressure. Not just Sania says no, but pressure that threatens Vivian's social ease. People like Vivian thrive on comfort. They thrive on being unquestioned. So the most satisfying conflict isn't necessarily a big screaming match. It's moments where Vivian's mask slips for half a second because she can't control the variables the way she wants. And when that happens, when the charm cracks, that's where acting can elevate everything. A good Vivian performance doesn't turn into a different person. It stays the same person, but with a microsecond of panic behind the eyes. A tightening jaw. A smile that arrives a beat too late. Those tiny breaks are what make a manipulator frightening, because they show you the machinery beneath the warmth. One last thread before I keep going deeper into the way the story's tension builds. The drama's central question isn't just, can fate be changed? It's, can a relationship be reinterpreted? Because Sania's second chance means she's watching her own past from the outside. She's seeing how Vivian used her. She's seeing the signs she missed. That kind of re-seeing can be devastating. It's like rereading a text conversation after you find out someone lied to you for months. Every lol becomes sinister. Every I miss you becomes strategy. That's the emotional horror that sits underneath the plot horror. And it's the reason the simplest scene, Vivian asking to borrow a car, can feel like the start of a war. And once you start watching the relationship get reinterpreted in real time, you realize the drama is doing something kind of vicious. It's forcing Sania to mourn a friendship while the other person is still alive and still talking to her. There's no funeral for that. There's no socially acceptable ritual where everyone shows up and says, I'm sorry your best friend turned out to be a threat. You just have to carry it privately and still show up to brunch, still answer texts, still navigate the little expectations of closeness. What makes it even more tense is that Sania can't afford to let Vivian know she's mourning. The safest thing for Sania is to act like everything is normal while quietly shifting the terrain under Vivian's feet. And that is such a psychologically exhausting way to live. Because your face has to be calm while your mind is screaming, don't give her anything. Don't give her access. Don't give her a story. It's a performance where the stakes are not embarrassment, but your entire life. I kept thinking about how the show's premise turns social etiquette into a weapon. In most dramas, politeness is just politeness. Here, politeness becomes camouflage. If Sania is too cold, Vivian can weaponize it. If Sania is too warm, Vivian can use it to get close. Every tone choice becomes strategy. And you, watching at home, start reading conversations the way you read chess moves, which is such a specific kind of tension that you don't get from bigger thrillers. The surveillance camera also introduces a really interesting philosophical problem. What does it mean to know something? In real life, we think knowing is about facts. In a story like this, knowing is also about whether facts can survive contact with other people's interpretations. Sania might know Vivian is dangerous, but does the world know it? Will the world ever know it? And if the world refuses to know it, what does Sania do with her knowledge? That's where the drama can turn from thriller into tragedy very quickly. Here's another hook that kept me locked in. If Sania successfully prevents the original accident, she's not just changing the future, she's also erasing the evidence of Vivian's worst act. And that's twisted, right? Because in the original timeline, the accident is horrific, but it's also proof of what Vivian did. If the accident never happens, Sania might lose the clearest path to exposing Vivian's capacity for harm. She's trading one kind of safety for a different kind of uncertainty. The person who framed her may never commit the exact same crime again. But that doesn't mean Vivian becomes safe. It just means Vivian becomes untested in the same way. That's one of the most under-discussed tensions in second-gen stories. People assume the good outcome is preventing the tragedy. And yes, morally, saving a life matters. But narratively and psychologically, preventing the tragedy can also remove the one undeniable moment that would have forced everyone to see the villain for what they are. In some stories, the villain only gets exposed because they overreach. If you stop the overreach, you might also delay justice. So the drama can become about this maddening idea. Doing the right thing might make it harder to prove you were right. And that's where Sania's internal conflict could get really gnarly if the writing is willing to sit in it. Imagine the guilt of thinking, even for 1 second, if the accident happened again, at least everyone would see. That's a horrifying thought. And it's not one you want your protagonist to have for long, but the fact that the premise can generate that moral discomfort is a sign the drama is playing with real stakes, not just plot. Another element that's baked into the premise is the question of institutional trust. In the previous life, Vivian framed Sania successfully. That means, at minimum, the systems around them were persuadable. Whether it was law enforcement, community gossip, workplace dynamics, family perceptions, some structure of authority or belief accepted Vivian's narrative. So Sania's camera isn't just about catching Vivian. It's about outmaneuvering institutions that failed her before. It's I can't rely on people to be fair, so I have to bring receipts. And I don't want to get too preachy here, but that is such a modern survival instinct. We've all watched situations where the truth loses to the better story. So when a drama reflects that anxiety, it hits something raw. It's not fantasy justice. It's messy. Now, visually, a drama like this has a chance to make the reset concept feel tangible without needing flashy effects. The simplest technique is contrast. Warmer lighting in scenes where Vivian is charming versus colder. Harsher tones in scenes where Sania is alone with her thoughts. Or the use of tight close-ups when Sania is forced to mask her fear because you want to see the micro-expression she won't allow anyone else to notice. Even something as basic as focusing on hands, the way Sania grips a phone, the way Vivian reaches for keys, can become a recurring language of control. I also love when these stories play with perspective shifts, not necessarily giving Vivian full POV, though that can be effective if done carefully, but even just letting the camera linger on Vivian a beat longer after Sania leaves the room. That extra beat can change everything. It can show you whether Vivian's friendliness is sincere, calculated, or simply habitual. And if the show is clever, it doesn't always answer you immediately. It keeps Vivian readable enough to be scary, but not so readable that the tension disappears. Because here's the danger with a villain like Vivian. If the show makes her too obviously villainous early on, it breaks the premise that she could frame Sania successfully. Framing requires credibility. Credibility requires social skill. So Vivian should be able to look like the victim. Vivian should be able to look like the reasonable friend. The more the show allows her to be socially effective, the more you understand how the previous timeline could have happened, and the more anxious you feel about it happening again. This is also where supporting characters, whoever they may be in the full show, become important as mirrors rather than plot devices. You need people around Sania who react in different ways, because that's what creates the social battlefield. One person might be quick to doubt Sania because they prefer harmony. Another might believe her, but still tell her to let it go. Another might be sympathetic, but scared of Vivian's influence. The drama doesn't have to turn every side character into a chess piece, but it should show you that Sania isn't just fighting one woman, she's fighting the way communities handle conflict. Most communities don't handle it well. There's a particular kind of conflict avoidance that can be just as dangerous as direct cruelty. People who say, I don't want to take sides. People who say, I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. In a story about framing, those people become enablers without meaning to. And if you've ever experienced a situation where someone harmed you and the crowd responded with, let's not make it awkward, this drama's premise is practically a punch to the chest. Something else I kept thinking about is how the drama might handle the concept of proof as a double-edged sword. Sania installs a camera. But what happens when the camera captures something ambiguous? What happens when it captures Sania doing something that, out of context, looks suspicious? Proof only protects you if it's legible and complete. Partial truth can be weaponized. And that's a really compelling idea in a story where the protagonist is trying to control narrative. Even the act of installing the camera can be spun. Vivian could frame it as Sania being controlling. Vivian could frame it as Sania hiding something. The camera is rational to us because we know Sania's context. But within the world of the drama, context is precisely what gets manipulated. So the camera isn't a clean solution. It's one more object Vivian can potentially build a story around. That is such a deliciously stressful setup. And speaking of stress, let's talk about pacing, because this is where I think a lot of viewers' reactions will live. This kind of drama has a naturally slow burn skeleton. The tension isn't built from constant events. It's built from constant anticipation. The audience is waiting for the rerouted tragedy, waiting for Vivian's next move, waiting for the moment Sania's mask cracks, waiting for the outside world to notice something is wrong. If you watch this expecting non-stop plot twists, you might get restless. But if you watch it like a psychological pressure cooker, it becomes addictive. There's a moment when you're deep into a story like this where you realize you're not even waiting for the accident anymore. You're waiting for the relationship to finally break in a way that can't be taped back together. You're waiting for the polite layer to rip. And the drama's job is to make that rip feel both inevitable and shocking. Like, of course this was coming, but also, oh no, it's here. I also want to highlight a subtle thing. Sania's refusal to lend the car is not just about agency. It's about refusing to be complicit in her own destruction. In the original timeline, she didn't know. She participated in the setup unknowingly. Now she knows, and knowledge demands a different response. That's where the drama can become a story about self-respect, not just revenge. Sania isn't simply trying to win. She's trying to live in a way that her future self won't regret. And yet, that comes with a painful side effect. When you stop being complicit, people often treat you like you're the one causing trouble. That's so real it almost hurts. The person who says no becomes the problem. The person who asks questions becomes the problem. The person who demands accountability becomes dramatic. In a drama about framing, that social inversion can be terrifying because it means Sania's attempt to protect herself could itself become evidence Vivian uses to paint her as unstable. That's why the most important battleground here isn't the road where an accident could happen. It's the social imagination. It's what people are willing to believe about Sania. It's what kind of woman they think she is. And the show's premise is basically screaming, this is how reputations become prisons. Now, because the spoiler approach here is full, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say fate reroutes. I'm not claiming some specific later twist I can't verify from the premise alone. I'm talking about the emotional contract of stories like this. They set up the day as a hinge point, and then they test whether the hinge can be forced back into place by human will. If the show wants to keep you hooked, it has to keep finding ways to make you doubt the control Sania thinks she has. And that doubt can come from really grounded sources. It can come from the fact that Vivian is resourceful. It can come from misunderstandings. It can come from the way multiple people's choices intersect. It can come from the sheer randomness of roads and timing. The show doesn't need magic to make fate feel heavy. It just needs to show how fragile safety is when someone is willing to lie. One thing I personally love in this genre is when the protagonist's competence grows, but their emotional stability doesn't grow at the same rate. Sania can become better at planning, better at setting traps, better at collecting evidence. But that doesn't mean she sleeps better. Sometimes it means she sleeps worse, because she's more aware of what can go wrong. Competence is not comfort. And if the show nails that, it avoids turning trauma into a power-up. Let's linger on Sania's inner life for a second, because this is where the acting and writing can either flatten her into the victim who fights back or make her a full person. Sania is carrying two versions of herself, the one who trusted and got destroyed, and the one who now refuses to be destroyed again. Those two selves don't automatically integrate. There's going to be whiplash. There's going to be moments where she acts bold and then collapses privately. There's going to be moments where she surprises herself with how cold she can be. And there's going to be guilt about that coldness. I always find it powerful when a drama shows that setting boundaries can feel like becoming someone you don't recognize, especially if you were raised to be agreeable, especially if you built your identity around being helpful. Sania refusing the car might look like strength, but it also might feel like a betrayal of who she thought she was. That's not weakness, that's transition. That's a person shading a skin that kept her safe socially but unsafe existentially. Now, if you're watching as someone who loves Vivian as a character, because yes, people do love well-written villains, I think the show's premise gives you something to chew on too. Vivian is fascinating not because she's bad, but because she reveals how morality can collapse under fear and entitlement. The act of framing is such an extreme moral choice that it forces you to ask, what kind of person crosses that line? What do they tell themselves? What do they feel afterward? Shame? Relief? Nothing? If the show is daring, it might hint that Vivian's worst weapon is her ability to feel justified. And that's where my sympathy ends, by the way. Understanding isn't absolution. I can analyze Vivian's possible inner logic and still think she's monstrous for using her friend as a shield. But as a viewer, I do want the villain to have an internal engine because it makes every scene tenser. When you can predict a villain's behavior only in the broadest sense, self-preservation at all costs, you stay nervous. When a villain is random, you get annoyed. When a villain is coherent, you get scared. Here's another thread that makes this drama emotionally sharp: the idea of debt. In friendships, we often carry unspoken debts. I've been there for you. I've helped you before. A manipulator can weaponize that. Vivian borrowing the car isn't just borrowing a car. It's a test of loyalty, a test of whether Sania will pay the debt of friendship. When Sania refuses, she's not only saying no to the car. She's saying no to the false economy of obligation Vivian may have built. And once you say no to that economy, you threaten the entire system the manipulator depends on. That's when they get creative. What I'd love for the drama to explore, and what it's already primed to explore, is how Sania rebuilds a support system that isn't contingent on being useful. Because if all your relationships are transactional, if people only like you when you lend them things, cover for them, make life easier for them, then of course someone like Vivian thrives in your orbit. The second chance here isn't only about changing one tragedy. It's about changing the kind of people Sania allows close. That's a painful, adult shift. And it's not instantly empowering. It can feel lonely. Cutting off a toxic friendship, even a dangerous one, can still feel like amputating a part of your daily routine. The drama has the potential to show that grief honestly rather than treating it as. And then she became a boss. Bosses grieve too. I also want to mention how a show like this can use objects as recurring triggers. The keys, obviously. The car itself. Maybe even the act of borrowing. Someone asking for something, anything, becomes loaded. Sania might start reacting to requests with suspicion, not because she's selfish, but because she's learned that requests can be traps. That's another subtle trauma symptom that drama sometimes skip over: how your worldview changes, how generosity becomes dangerous, how you start scanning for hidden costs. And that's a really sad thing, actually. One of the tragedies of betrayal is that it steals your ability to give freely. It makes love conditional. So if Sania's arc includes learning to trust again, not Vivian, obviously, but trust in general, that could be one of the most satisfying emotional payoffs the drama could aim for. But before we even get to that kind of healing, there's a big, juicy, nerve-wracking question hanging over everything. When Vivian realizes there's a camera, what does she do? Again, I'm not asserting a specific later scene. I'm saying it's the natural escalation point. The camera is a secret advantage only as long as it's secret. The moment it's discovered, the conflict changes shape. It stops being Sania quietly gathers proof and becomes Vivian adapts. And adaptation is where the mind games get nastiest. Because Vivian might not confront Sania directly. Vivian might start performing for the camera. Vivian might behave impeccably in its view and become worse elsewhere. Vivian might try to make Sania look like the creeper for installing it. Vivian might even use the camera's existence to strengthen her own narrative. See? Sania's paranoid. Sania's spying. Sania's not well. That kind of inversion is exactly how framing works. You take the victim's defense and recast it as aggression. And if the show leans into that inversion, that's where it can get genuinely painful in a way that's hard to watch but hard to look away from. Because it's not just thriller pain. It's social pain. It's the pain of being misunderstood and outperformed by someone who has less conscience and more charisma. What's so compelling about Sania as a protagonist in this setup is that she's not fighting with the usual weapons. She's not a cop. She's not a lawyer. She's not someone who automatically has institutional power. She's a person trying to protect herself with household-level tools. A refusal, a camera, vigilance. That makes the story feel intimate. It also makes it feel precarious. Because normal people's defenses are fragile. And that fragility is exactly what keeps you watching. You don't feel like Sania is guaranteed to win just because she's the main character. The premise tells you she already lost once. That matters. A protagonist who has already been defeated carries a different kind of tension than a protagonist who's never been tested. Sania has scars, even if nobody can see them yet. I'm going to keep pulling on this thread because it's the emotional thesis for me. The drama isn't just about stopping a crash. It's about stopping a story from being written over your life. And the scariest part is that stories can be written with very little. A single photo. A single witness who thinks they saw something. A single rumor. If Vivian is the kind of person who framed Sania once, she's the kind of person who understands that. So the next time you watch a scene that looks mundane, a conversation in a living room, a friendly interaction, a request for help, ask yourself what the subtext might be. Who's gathering material? Who's planting impressions? Who's preparing a narrative? Because in a drama like Kecelakaan Akan Terjadi, the real action often happens in the subtext. And the moment you start noticing that, the show becomes less of a straightforward redo story and more like a slow, meticulous dissection of how betrayal operates in plain sight, especially when it's packaged as friendship. And what makes it even more insidious is that plain sight doesn't look like evil. It looks like concern. It looks like someone being helpful. It looks like a friend who's always around, always available, always somehow at the center of whatever's happening. Vivian borrowing the car is just the obvious version of access. The scarier version is the emotional access. The kind where she already knows what words will make Sania hesitate, what tone will make other people soften, what story beats will sound believable because they fit the role Vivian has cast herself in. That's why I keep coming back to the idea that this drama's true genre isn't just thriller, it's also social horror. The monster doesn't jump out of the closet. The monster sits at your table and asks you how your day was. The monster calls you bestie. And the most frightening part is that the monster knows you better than you know yourself because she's been studying you through the intimacy you gave her. A small but crucial craft choice in stories like this is whether the show allows Sania to be angry in the present, or whether it forces her to keep swallowing it. Anger is clarifying. Anger is protective. But anger is also risky in a social environment that loves to label women as emotional the second they stop being convenient. If Sania ever raises her voice, Vivian can point and go, "See? This is what I've been dealing with." So Sania's anger has to be expressed strategically or privately, or in ways that don't give Vivian ammunition. That is an unfair burden, and the drama's tension comes from watching Sania carry it anyway. You can almost feel how Sania's brain is doing constant cost-benefit calculations. If she confronts Vivian now, she tips her hand. If she stays silent, she feels complicit. If she goes to someone for help, she risks sounding paranoid. If she isolates, she becomes vulnerable. There isn't a perfect move, only moves with different consequences. And I love stories that don't pretend there's a clean path through that kind of situation. There's a specific moment I wish every viewer would notice because it changes how you read everything after. The instant Sania decides to install the camera, she's essentially choosing to live in a pre-trial mindset. She's gathering evidence before the crime can even be alleged. That's not normal life. That's life after you've been taught that your word is not enough. And once you've lived in a world where your word wasn't enough, it's hard to ever go back to softness. Now, here's where the drama can get really interesting structurally. In a lot of reset narratives, the protagonist's main weapon is knowledge of events. This happens on this day, at this time. But in a story like this, the key knowledge isn't just about events. It's about a person. Sania knows Vivian's capacity, but she might not know Vivian's full method. She knows the outcome, framed, ruined, blamed for a fatal accident. But she may not know every step Vivian took to make that outcome stick. So the second chance becomes an investigation into her own past. Sania isn't only trying to prevent the future, she's trying to understand the mechanics of how she was destroyed. And that's a very specific kind of narrative pleasure. It's not the pleasure of twist, twist, twist. It's the pleasure of slowly seeing the scaffolding behind a lie. It's the pleasure of watching a protagonist reclaim the parts of their story that were stolen by someone else's narrative. If the drama commits to that, it becomes as much about epistemology, how we know what we know, as it is about suspense. The next question that naturally follows is, how does Mrs. Helen fit into this beyond being the victim of the accident? Because if the drama wants to level up, Mrs. Helen can become the axis where morality and self-interest collide. Sania wants to save her. Yes. But does Vivian have a relationship to Mrs. Helen? Is Mrs. Helen a stranger? Or is she connected in a way that deepens the stakes? Again, I'm not stating specifics, but you can feel how many possibilities the premise opens. If Mrs. Helen is connected to Vivian's life, then the act of killing her and framing Sania becomes even colder. If Mrs. Helen is a stranger, then it becomes a commentary on how innocent lives become collateral in someone else's panic. Either way, Mrs. Helen's presence should push Sania out of pure self-defense mode and into something more complicated. Because if you're only protecting yourself, it's easier to justify anything. But if you're also protecting someone else, your choices get heavier. You can't just say, I'll burn everything down, and I don't care who gets hurt, because someone already got hurt. Someone already died. The show has the chance to make Sania's morality part of the suspense. Will she keep choosing prevention even when revenge would feel more satisfying? And if you're someone who normally skips friendship dramas because you assume they're going to be small stakes, this is the one that kind of proves how wrong that assumption can be. Because the show is using friendship as the Trojan horse for something uglier. The way intimacy gives someone access to the soft parts of you. Vivian doesn't have to break into Sania's house. She's already welcome. That's the horror. Something else that really stands out to me in this premise is how it flips the usual accident narrative. Most stories about accidents are about randomness, about bad luck, about one terrible moment that couldn't be predicted. Here, the accident is almost beside the point, because the true crime is what happens afterward. Vivian's decision to frame Sania is what turns tragedy into a deliberate annihilation. And by resetting to the day the car was borrowed, the drama is basically saying the real moment of danger wasn't the crash. It was the request. That is such a sharp, almost petty-sounding detail that becomes enormous once you understand the stakes. Now, there's a craft challenge baked into that, and I want to talk about it because it affects how the whole show feels. When your hinge point is a small domestic interaction, you have to make that interaction endlessly rewatchable without making it repetitive. You have to keep finding new angles, new micro-shifts, new emotional colors. The camera can't just sit there and film the same conversation 10 times and expect you to be thrilled. The writing has to slightly adjust the temperature each time Sania and Vivian share space. One of the best ways to do that, again, speaking in general terms, is to let Sania's strategy evolve. Not just in tactics, but in how she thinks. Early on, her strategy is block the obvious threat, refuse the car, install the camera. But later, a story like this becomes much more interesting if Sania starts thinking systemically. If she starts asking, what conditions allowed Vivian to frame me last time? Was it a lack of witnesses? Was it that Sania didn't have an alibi? Was it that Vivian had a relationship with certain people who vouched for her? Was it that Sania's own reputation made her easy to suspect? Those are the questions that move the story from reactive to proactive. And if the show lets Sania ask those questions, you get to watch her build a new life architecture. Not just one wall of defense, but a whole structure where Vivian has fewer angels of attack. That's satisfying because it feels earned, and it feels realistic. If you've been burned that badly, you don't just avoid one flame. You redesign the kitchen. Here's where I think this drama's premise has real potential to surprise people. It can become a story about identity. Not in a lofty, who am I monologue way, but in a lived, social way. Because if Vivian framed Sania successfully, then Sania's identity in the eyes of others got rewritten. She became the one who did it, or the one who was involved, or the one who can't be trusted. So when Sania gets a second chance, she's not only trying to avoid being framed again, she's trying to keep her identity intact before anyone else has the chance to define it for her. That's why even tiny choices will matter. Who does she talk to? Who does she keep close? What does she share? What does she keep private? Every choice is an investment in how she'll be perceived when things get messy. It's basically reputation management under existential threat, which sounds cynical, but it's actually a survival skill in a world where truth doesn't automatically win. And the more the show leans into that, the more it becomes this quiet critique of how society treats women's credibility. Because framing doesn't work unless people are willing to believe the worst version of you. That willingness is never neutral. It's shaped by bias, by gender expectations, by who is considered emotional versus rational, by who is considered nice versus difficult. Vivian, to successfully frame Sania, would have had to position herself as the more believable one. That implies she knows how to perform believability. So I get really interested in how the show might portray Vivian's performance. Does she cry at the right times? Does she present herself as just trying to help? Does she speak softly while implying Sania is unstable? Those details matter because they're the real mechanics of the crime. The accident is the headline. The framing is the campaign. And since this is a YouTube review script, and I'm being honest with you like I would on camera, I'm always a little wary of dramas like this because sometimes they use female friendship betrayal as an excuse to make women look inherently cruel or catty, like it's some inevitable outcome of women being close. I don't like that framing. It's lazy and it's kind of misogynistic. The version of this story that works is the one that treats Vivian's betrayal as Vivian's moral choice, not as women are like this. And the version that really works is the one that also allows other women, like Mrs. Helen, like any female side characters, to exist with complexity and dignity, not just as props in a war between two people. That's one of those places where I'm opinionated. I can enjoy a villainous character, but I want the writing to be careful about what it implies beyond that character. If Vivian is monstrous, fine. But don't make the world of women feel like a snake pit by default. Make it feel like one person exploited trust, and other people are navigating the fallout in different ways. Now, a question that keeps coming up for me as the story progresses from that initial reset is, what does Sania want besides not being framed? Because not being framed is a negative goal. It's a goal defined by avoidance. The most emotionally satisfying arc is when the protagonist develops a positive goal again, something they're moving toward, not just away from. Maybe it's a sense of justice. Maybe it's protecting Mrs. Helen. Maybe it's reclaiming her sense of self. But the show needs something that feels like a life, not just a defense plan. And I say that because I've watched too many revenge and reset dramas where the protagonist becomes a walking checklist of countermeasures. It's compelling for a while, and then you start to miss the person. You start to miss the softness, the hobbies, the little ordinary joys that remind you what's at stake. Sania can't just be a trauma response for 20 hours. She has to be a human being who remembers how to laugh at something that isn't bitter. If the show gives her those moments, even small ones, they hit like oxygen. Because the darker and more tense the drama is, the more powerful it is when the protagonist experiences a tiny breath of normalcy. And then, of course, the show can take that normalcy and threaten it, which is cruel, but narratively effective. The contrast is what makes you feel. Let's pull the camera back a little and talk about theme. The drama's title is a declaration. that accident will not happen. A declaration implies willpower. It implies agency. It implies that the universe can be argued with, negotiated with, outsmarted. The story's premise, though, is about something that often feels bigger than willpower: social harm, betrayal, blame. Those things can be sticky in ways that make you feel powerless even when you're technically right. So the show, at its best, sits in that contradiction. Sania's will is strong, but the world is complicated. Sania can do everything right and still be vulnerable because people aren't computers. They don't evaluate evidence fairly. They evaluate vibes, relationships, and their own comfort. Vivian's power is that she understands that. That's why I think the drama's most important scenes aren't the ones where Sania is alone setting up equipment or making plans. The most important scenes are the ones where Sania is in front of other people and has to decide whether to speak, how much truth is safe to reveal. Those are the scenes where you see how trauma changes communication. Do you hint? Do you warn? Do you stay silent because you know you'll sound crazy? Do you tell the whole story and risk being dismissed? That's such a real dilemma. And I have to give the premise credit for making the dilemma urgent. It's not like Sania can just go no contact easily, because the threat is tied to a specific day and a specific event. Even if she wants to cut Vivian off, she has to navigate the immediate danger window. Cutting off a close friend, depending on their social circles, can also cause backlash. It can create questions. It can create narratives. If Vivian is smart, Vivian could preempt that and cast herself as abandoned or betrayed. So Sania's choices are complicated no matter what. There's also grim irony here. The more careful Sania is, the more she risks looking guilty. That's how it works in real life too. People interpret caution as suspicious. They interpret preparation as, why are you preparing if you didn't do anything? It's nonsense, but it's common. So Sania's second chance becomes this balancing act where she has to be careful enough to survive, but not so careful that she paints a target on herself socially. That's why the camera, again, is both genius and risky. It's smart, but it can also be framed as paranoia. And I love that the drama's premise allows those two truths to coexist. Another element I'm drawn to is the idea of moral contamination. When you fight someone like Vivian, you risk becoming someone you don't like. Not because you become evil, but because you adopt tactics you wouldn't have used in a healthier relationship. You start withholding. You start monitoring. You start strategizing. You start thinking like your enemy. That's a real psychological cost. And if the show is brave enough to acknowledge it, it elevates the story beyond simple revenge gratification. And to be clear, I'm not saying Sania shouldn't defend herself. She should. I'm saying it's interesting when the show doesn't pretend defense is emotionally clean. Defense can harden you. Defense can isolate you. Defense can change how you relate to everyone, not just the person harming you. A lot of this comes down to how the drama frames changing destiny. If the show treats destiny as a puzzle, solve it, and you win, then it's more of a thriller game. If the show treats destiny as an emotional burden, carry it, and it changes you, then it becomes something more human. Based on the premise, I think it wants to be the second kind, because the reset isn't being used as a gimmick. It's being used as a wound reopened. Now, I want to talk about Mrs. Helen as a symbol, but also as a person, because that distinction matters. In the best version of this story, Mrs. Helen is not just the woman who dies. She's a reminder that collateral damage is real, that someone's mother, someone's friend, someone's person got erased. If Sania's second chance allows her to interact with Mrs. Helen even briefly, again, not inventing specifics, just talking about possibilities, that could be one of the most emotionally potent choices the show could make. Because then Mrs. Helen becomes a face, a voice, a human presence, and the pressure to save her stops being abstract. And if the show does that, it also creates a painful layer. Sania might be one of the only people who knows Mrs. Helen is in danger. That kind of secret is heavy. It can make you feel like you're walking around with a countdown in your pocket. Every moment with Mrs. Helen, if it exists, would carry the ache of you don't know what almost happened to you. This is where the cinematography and music can do something quietly devastating. A simple scene, someone crossing a street, a car idling, a pedestrian light changing, could become terrifying if you know what's supposed to happen. You don't need a crash to feel the threat of a crash. You just need the shadow of it. And I'll tell you something personal. I'm a person who gets tense in traffic scenes in fiction even when the story isn't about accidents. So a drama that's literally anchored to the day of the crash is basically my nightmare viewing experience. In a good way, but still, I'm the viewer who's like, why are we walking near roads at all? Everyone go home. Cancel cars. That's my brain. The show also has an opportunity to explore guilt from an unexpected angle. Vivian's guilt or lack of it. If Vivian framed Sania successfully in the previous life, did she ever feel guilt? Did she bury it? Did she rationalize it? Does she genuinely believe her own narrative? Those questions matter because they determine how she'll behave when the second chance disrupts her plan. A person with guilt behaves differently under pressure than a person without it. Guilt can make you sloppy. Lack of guilt can make you smooth. Both are dangerous. Now, I'm going to drop another rehook here because I think it's the most interesting potential turning point in the entire story. What happens when Sania realizes her no isn't enough? Because at some point, the story has to show you that boundaries alone don't stop a person who's willing to commit harm. Boundaries are necessary, but they're not always sufficient. The moment Sania understands that, really understands it, is the moment the story can become something else. It stops being about avoiding one incident and becomes about dismantling a threat. And dismantling a threat means choices that are morally and emotionally complicated. It might mean involving other people. It might mean risking not being believed. It might mean exposing herself to danger. It might mean sacrificing comfort and reputation for safety and truth. Those are hard choices. And the drama can make them land if it treats them as hard, not as obvious. It's also worth talking about how the show might handle time and memory. In a reset narrative, memory is the protagonist's secret weapon, but it's also their private torment. Sania remembers a life where she was framed. That memory likely includes the moment she realized she was trapped, the moment people turned on her, the moment the lies solidified. Those memories don't just inform her strategy, they inform her emotional triggers. Vivian might say a phrase that echoes something from the previous timeline. Vivian might touch the same object. Vivian might use the same tone. Those echoes can cause Sania to freeze or panic even when the immediate danger isn't present. That's real trauma behavior. If the show includes those echoes, again, not claiming exact scenes, just describing the kind of storytelling that would fit, then it becomes a more authentic depiction of how the past bleeds into the present. It's not magic. It's psychology. Editing can support that beautifully by using quick flashes of memory, not as cheap jump cuts, but as intrusive thoughts. A split second of headlights. A split second of a hospital corridor. A split second of a document with her name on it. Those are the kinds of images that can haunt without being over-explained. And if the show does it subtly, it won't feel like, look, trauma. It'll feel like how trauma actually works. Uninvited, inconvenient, bodily. The sound design can also make those intrusions feel physical. A distant siren sound that isn't really there. The muffled echo of tires. A heartbeat-like bass note when Vivian reaches for something. If the show uses these as motifs, it can train your body as a viewer to react the way Sania reacts. That's immersive storytelling. I also think there's a fascinating tension around control. Sania's second chance gives her the illusion of control because she knows what's coming. But control is fragile. The universe doesn't have to fight her. It just has to be complex. Other people can act unpredictably. Vivian can change tactics. Mrs. Helen can appear in a different context. Small delays can cascade. That's why the most engaging version of this story is the one where Sania's knowledge gives her an edge but not dominance. Because dominance would make it boring. Struggle makes it meaningful. Another subtle thing I hope the drama understands is that Sania's refusal to lend the car might not just be a protective act. It might be a trigger for Vivian's resentment. In the original timeline, Vivian may have felt entitled to Sania's help. So a refusal is not just a boundary, it's an insult. An entitlement plus insult is a nasty cocktail. It can push a manipulator from opportunistic harm into deliberate revenge. That escalation is plausible and it's terrifying because it means Sania's self-protection could provoke the very danger she's trying to avoid. That's not to say she should have lent the car. Absolutely not. It's to say the show has room to explore how toxic people respond to boundaries. They don't respond with, oh, okay. They respond with punishment. And if the show goes that route, it can become a story about boundary backlash, which is such a real phenomenon that doesn't get enough representation. People talk about just set boundaries like it's a magic fix. The hard truth is, boundaries reveal who benefits from you not having them. Vivian benefited from Sania not having them. So the boundary is a threat to Vivian's comfort and control. Now, as a viewer, I'm always looking for whether a show like this gives the protagonist moments of cleverness that feel plausible rather than convenient. The camera is plausible. The refusal is plausible. The next steps, whatever they are, have to stay grounded. If the show suddenly has Sania pulling off impossible schemes with perfect timing, it will lose the emotional authenticity that makes the premise hit. But if the show lets her be clever in human ways, anticipating patterns, documenting, building alliances cautiously, then every win feels like a real fight. And those alliances, if they happen, are where relationships beyond Vivian can become emotionally satisfying. Because if Sania has been isolated by lie once, then rebuilding trust with someone new or someone she previously overlooked can be deeply cathartic. It can also be risky because trusting again is terrifying after betrayal. The show has an opportunity to make those interactions feel tender, hesitant, and hard-won. I'll keep going with this thought because it's the kind of thing that separates a good thriller from a great one. If the drama only gives you two poles, Sania good, Vivian bad, you get tension, sure, but you don't get texture. Texture comes from the gray spaces. The friend who means well but doesn't fully get it. The authority figure who cares but is constrained. The bystander who chooses comfort over truth. Those characters create a world that feels real, and they make Sania's fight feel bigger than a personal feud. And bigger doesn't mean less intimate. It actually makes it more intimate because it shows how one betrayal can ripple through everything. Your routines, your friendships, your sense of safety in public spaces, your willingness to accept help. When the show captures those ripples, you start feeling the weight of the previous timeline, even when nothing dramatic is happening in the current one. Which brings me to what I think is the most compelling emotional tension the premise offers. Sania is trying to prevent a tragedy, but she's also trying to prevent herself from becoming someone she doesn't recognize. And that second battle might be harder than the first because it's internal. Vivian can be outsmarted. Troima is more stubborn. The drama's title claims certainty. Sania's heart, realistically, can't feel certain. So every time the story pushes toward a moment that resembles the original tragedy day, the real suspense isn't just will the accident happen. It's will Sania break? Will she lose her nerve? Will she lose her temper? Will she do something impulsive? Will she trust the wrong person? Will she become the version of herself Vivian wants to paint? That is so much pressure for a character to carry, and it's why, if the performance nails it, you end up not just entertained, but emotionally invested in Sania's endurance in a way that feels almost protective, like you're rooting for her to keep her humanity intact, even as the story keeps squeezing, and the next squeeze, if it's written well, should come not from an obvious external threat, but from a situation where doing the morally right thing and doing the strategically smart thing are not the same option. forcing Sania to choose what kind of person she wants to be this time around.